Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Over the past weekend, GGG announced both Path of Exile 2 and also 3.22. Now, because the main focus of ExileCon was Path of Exile 2, a lot of questions about 3.22 haven't really been able to be answered as yet. I wanted to combine a list of the most frequently asked questions that I've seen, and also a list of things that I think people are often getting wrong, put them all into one place and submit them to GGG. I wouldn't mind seeing an authoritative answer list from the company themselves, because whilst I feel I could answer most of these questions myself, there's always a few that you get wrong because there's just so many corner cases within the game, and it would be good to get an authoritative set of answers to these questions because I am seeing them a lot. I will put what I believe the answers to be down in the description of this video below, but they're not authoritative answers until they come from Grinding Gear Games. The first questions all relate to the Chieftain Ascendancy. So firstly, the Ascendant has a node called Chieftain. This contains mods that thematically link to the 321 Chieftain, but that don't really thematically link to the 322 Chieftain at all. Will this Ascendancy notable be changed? Secondly, Tukahama War's Herald interacts with the support gems Ancestral Call and Fist of War, and there's also a fair bit of support in this Ascendancy for using the existing skill gem Searing Bond. My question about those three gems is, are any of them looking like they're going to get any significant changes? Or can we rely upon them working the same way that they do now while we're planning our characters? Next, Ramako Sun's Light. How will this interact with other effects that raise or lower a monster's resistance to fire? For example, the Flammability Curse, Scorch, or Searing Exarch altars that read map bosses have 160% increased fire resistance. When you meet Ramako's conditions, does this overwrite the monster's base fire resistance to 0, or does it overwrite the post-modification fire resistance to 0? Next, Tassalio. How will Tassalio interact with modifiers that grant all elemental resistances? For example, if you allocate Tassalio and you have a 40% Goldrum on your head, does this provide 40% total cold resist, or does it provide 60%? How will Tassalio interact with modifiers that grant fire and cold resistance? Or for example, fire and chaos resistance, multiple resistances. Will a 20% double resist fire and cold benchcraft grant 30% cold resist in total, or will it only grant the 20? How does Tassalio handle rounding? How does Velako interact with modifiers to all maximum resistances? For example, the modifier on Saffel's Frame, or the map mod of Exposure, or to modifiers to all maximum elemental resistances? What area of effect do Hinekora Corpse Explosions have? What player stats scale Hinekora Corpse Explosions? Can Hinekora Corpse Explosions be converted to Chaos via the Consuming Dark? Can Hinekora Corpse Explosions gain the ability to poison through the use of convoluted mechanics involving Volker's Guidance and generic chance to poison on hit? If Hinekora Explosions gain the capacity to ignite, do the player stats increased fire damage and increased fire damage over time multiplier scale this damage? As per the last question, this time for poison, if you have chaos damage or chaos damage over time multiplier on your character, would this scale any poison that is inflicted by Hinekora Death's Fury if you were to go that way? Next question is a really simple one about our favourite totem node, Moon's Presence. You'll notice I'm missing the first word, and that's because I have no idea how to pronounce this. How do you pronounce this particular Ascendancy notable? And exactly the same question for Forest's Strength down the bottom. Also on the totem node, this one states that you recoup 10% of damage taken by your totems as life. Is this 10% of the damage taken by the totem before or after the 80% less damage that totems take when they're hit by an enemy? What about before or after the 40% elemental resist and 20% chaos resist that totems have by default? The same totem node states totems taunt enemies around them for 4 seconds when they are summoned. What is this radius? Also on the same topic of totem taunts, totem summoning by default takes 600 milliseconds. If you have this node and no totem placement speed effects, and you summon a totem at t equals 0, is it correct to assume that at t equals 600 milliseconds, the totem checks all monsters that are within its range at that very instant, applies a 4-second long taunt to those monsters unless that taunt is removed early, for example by the totem dying, and then does not attempt to taunt again if new monsters enter its range during the taunt duration? Or is it something else entirely? Next, a few questions related to Namahu Flame's Advance, because this one has some messy interactions. If a player allocates Namahu and puts a non-unique jewel into a jewel socket that is not a part of their regular passive tree, but has instead been added to their passive tree through the use of a cluster jewel, will this modify any nodes at all? If a player allocates Namahu and then allocates the notable on the passive tree Saboteur. Now this is of course not the Ascendant node called Saboteur, this is the one that's in the shadow area, and it reads in part 30% increased trap damage, 30% increased mine damage. If that player then puts a rare jewel into the socket between Inspired and Frenetic on the tree, which does reach to Saboteur, does Saboteur grant 30% or 60% fire damage? If a player allocates Namahu and sockets Brutal Restraint number 7476 into the Scion West jewel, this grants the additional text minions deal 20% increased damage to the notable node Constitution. If that player then puts a rare jewel into the Scion South node, will that Constitution rider then be converted into 20% fire damage, or will it remain minions deal 20% increased damage? If a player allocates Spiritual Aid and Namahu, what will happen to a passive node that reads minions deal 10% increased damage, and that is within range of a non-unique jewel? Finally, on the Forest Strength node, we've already mentioned the question about pronunciation for that one, but what does the level 20 skill here do for strikes? What does this level 20 skill do for slams? Is it the same for slams as it is in 3.21, or is it different? And what exactly does it do for strikes, because it can't do anything for strikes in the current game? The next series of questions all relate to the Guardian Ascendancy. So the Ascendant Notable Guardian contains mods that are thematically tied to the 321 Guardian, such as its charge sharing, but these do not thematically tie to the 322 Guardian at all. Will the Ascendant Notable be changed? Next, Time of Need. Assuming that a player has 4,800 maximum life, Time of Need allocated, and equips the unique gloves Calm Spirit, will that player regain 48 rage over 1 second once every 4 seconds in lieu of gaining their 4,800 life? Next, how does the newly buffed Time of Need interact with the Recovery Mastery that causes players to only recover life once every 4 seconds? A couple of questions about Radiant Crusade. This grants level 20 Summon Sentinel of Radiance. Now usually for fairly good reasons, players cannot use level 20 skills until their character level is approximately level 69. Will this skill be balanced around the capacity of low level players to use this skill? What is a Summon Sentinel of Radiance anyway? And continuing on the minion wing of this Guardian, are summoned elemental relics from Unwavering Crusade durable enough that we can rely upon them against bosses? Will there be a way to use this notable at all in boss fights with minimal or no adds, such as Cyrus Awakener of Worlds, the Maven, or Phase 1 of All the Crystal King? What is a summoned elemental relic anyway? Can we have its stats? Is Bastion of Hope a radius of 60 or something else? Harmony of Purpose uses the word between. Now the word between can have a number of different meanings, and I wanted to pick this word apart and get an exact description of what Harmony of Purpose does. Firstly, is this an inclusive or an exclusive interpretation of the word between? Or to put that another way, if I asked you to pick a whole number between 1 and 3, would you be forced to pick 2, or would you be allowed to pick 1 or 3? Secondly, does between here mean your ally's hitbox is in contact with the graphical effect of the link, or does it instead mean something more restrictive, like your ally's hitbox is in contact with the line segment that connects the middle of your hitbox to the middle of your linked target's hitbox? Or is it the least restrictive possible interpretation, which is that in the triangle that has corners you, your ally, and your linked target, neither the angle at you nor the ally at your linked target is obtuse? In other words, if you are at the center of the Guardian Ascendancy and you're linked to Unwavering Faith, is Harmony of Purpose deemed to be between you or not? Because if the link goes from the center of Unwavering Faith to the center of you, it's probably not quite going to connect with Harmony of Purpose's hitbox. On the flip side, with the most permissive interpretation possible of the word between, if you're here and you're linked to Unwavering Faith up here, Radiant Faith itself might be deemed to be between you, because its projection onto the line between you and Unwavering Faith is between Unwavering Faith and you. So that's the question I've got there. What exactly is meant by the word between in the context of Harmony of Purpose? Finally, Radiant Faith grants armor and energy shield based upon your character's reserved mana. Is this then scaled by the statistics of the recipient? For example, if you reserve 5,000 mana and thus you impart 500 energy shield, and the recipient of this buff is a player that has 77% increased energy shield on their passive tree, will they then gain 885 energy shield, or will they only gain 500? Next, I have a number of questions that relate to Hinakora's Lock, the new crafting item. Imagine for the purposes of this question that Alice is considering applying a Fracturing Orb to a Cluster Jewel. She wipes Hinakora's hair over it first. If Alice is disappointed with the predicted results that the Fracturing Orb would give and elects not to go ahead with it, is her Fracturing Orb consumed anyway, or does she just simply not apply it at all? If Alice is disappointed with the results predicted for the Fracturing Orb and elects not to go ahead, Hinakora's Lock states the Cluster Jewel loses the ability to foresee the future. How permanent is this loss? Does it just end the predictive power of the Hinakora's Lock that you have already used? Or does it take a more restrictive approach and forever remove the ability to foresee the future from that Cluster Jewel so that a second Hinakora's Lock would not help? Applying a Currency Orb can, quite rarely, leave the item itself unmodified. For example, if you apply a Divine Orb to a Cluster Jewel that has 3 notables on it, sometimes the 4th mod will simply not change, it will roll the same thing it had before, and the item has not been modified even though currency has been used on it. If this outcome happens, is the item considered to have been modified for the purposes of losing the ability to foresee? How does Hinakora's Lock interact with Vaal Orbs? We know that Eternal Orbs do not allow you to revert an item back to the state they were in before they were Vaaled if you're disappointed with the Vaal Orb result. Is that the same with Hinakora's Lock? Or does Hinakora's Lock interact in a different way to the way that Eternal Orbs do? Finally, in order to help people manage their expectations as to how many of these they're likely to get, would you say that in terms of the order of magnitude of this item's rarity, it is closer to a Chaos Orb, a Divine Orb, a Sacred Orb, or to a Mirror of Kalandra? Next, there are 2 questions that relate to omens, specifically the Omen of the Soul Devourer. This specifies no duration. Does this mean it has an unlimited duration until you leave the zone that it goes off in? And finally, the Omen of Fortune. This thing strikes me as something that's going to be very, very, very rare. Rarity order of magnitude to help people set their expectations as to whether they're likely to see this themselves or have to trade for it if they want to use it. Would you consider an Omen of Fortune to be closer to a Chaos Orb, a Divine Orb, a Sacred Orb, or a Mirror of Kalandra in rarity? The next questions relate to the Trial of the Ancestors itself. Do you anticipate players treating this like Blight, taking extensive advantage of their allies, in the case of Blight that would be the towers, early in their character's progression, then eventually outgrowing the need to do this as their character gets more and more powerful, and they eventually reach a point where they just start soloing the entire enemy team and all of their totems? Or have you taken specific actions to prevent this from happening? Do our allies that are provided by the Trial of the Ancestors scale up in power as our characters do, or just as the monster level of the zones that we're fighting in do? How does the Trial of the Ancestors work in party play? And are there any League-specific boss encounters along the lines of Heist the Unbreakable? Next, a question that relates to the League Start race. pathofexile.com/ancestor for the actual announcement page specifies that this race is to kill 7 pinnacle bosses on the same character. However, it was specified in the ExileCon announcement that you would need to kill all 7 Uber pinnacle bosses. Could you please clarify which of these 2 is the goal? And finally, I think the question that I have seen asked the most. This relates to the Forbidden Tomes. Is there going to be any way that we can target farm Sanctum Forbidden Tomes, or are they just going to be entirely RNG drops? Anyways, that is a list of the most frequently asked questions that I've seen specifically about patch 3.22. I'm going to leave it there. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results. Until then, have fun!